Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack, where yet again I've been left alone and everyone's gone to the pub. But I've got a good one this week. I'm doing a good one this week in something that I don't know that much about. So this is going to be really interesting for me. This is Jonathan North, who is a writer and historian who specialises in the Napoleonic Wars. And he's written a dozen or so books, including Nelson in Naples and Killing Napoleon. But he's here today to talk about his newest book, Napoleon's Invasion of Egypt. I don't know why I put Europe in the notes. But Jonathan, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm fine. Well, he did also invade Europe, let's be fair. It wasn't just Egypt.
And annoyingly, this is the third intro I've messed up in 3 episodes. I got someone's book title wrong and I got the author's name wrong.
Fourth time lucky.
I think I'm going to have to hand the prep over to someone else. But that does set up quite nicely because obviously we know Napoleon did invade Europe, Spain, Portugal, Germany, part of Russia. Why was he invading Egypt in 1798?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really strange adventure that took place in 1798. So, well, I think we probably better start with Napoleon himself. He's an important character, still making films about him even. So, he was only part of the reason, though. So a lot of people tend to ascribe this episode to Napoleon's personal ambition. He was definitely a leader rather than a follower. And of course, the year before, he'd just victoriously conquered Italy in a really impressive way, basically imposing peace on continental Europe. So very much a leader, very much got to a dead end by early 1798, looking for new challenges. And one of the things about Napoleon, I think, that perhaps doesn't always come out is how much of a dreamer he was. So in his youth, when he was in boarding school in dreary French towns, he would give himself over to reading history, and history in those days was very much boys' own adventure stuff. And he threw himself into studying the classics. And he had this real interest in Alexander the Great and the ancient Greeks, wars with Persia. And in a sense, that sort of remained with him. So he had an abiding interest in Egypt and the Middle East. But it has to be said as well that he knew his geopolitics. So he kind of combines dreaming with geopolitical ambition. He was aware that France, 1797, 1798, had decided war in Europe. It had conquered Italy and made the Mediterranean pretty much a French lake with Spanish alliance. So Egypt, in a way, would cement that French domination of the old Greek-Roman world. If he could bring that into French Empire, then that was really beneficial. And of course, that would also play a role in Napoleon's plans to knock Britain out of the war. Of course, there were other players involved. Napoleon's just one, albeit central character, but there's the French government also at work, and they also share that ambition of knocking Britain out of the war. Why does Egypt matter to that? It's because in those days, British trade and rule in India was on the rise, and a lot of goods and money was flowing from India through the Middle East to Europe. And the French thought, well, if we seize and secure Egypt, then we can act as a barrier to that trade. So that's sort of the bigger picture, that economic war, that war between France and Britain. Egypt plays quite a central role. And there's another aspect to that, I think, that people don't always think of, and it's that the French and Europeans generally were starting to look at Egypt as a place of great potential. There was talk about the canal, even back in the 1790s, about cutting a canal from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. There was an idea that Egypt could grow sugarcane, coffee, wheat, cotton, obviously Egypt's much closer to Europe than the West Indies, which had hitherto been growing and sending to Europe all these colonial goods. And Europeans were starting to think, well, if we grew this stuff in Africa, actually we wouldn't need to ship slaves across to the West Indies at all. We could keep them where they are. And the British and the Danes were already starting to think in the 1790s in places like Sierra Leone that they could do this. And I think the French government, it certainly was planning to do this sort of thing in Egypt. So there's a lot of sort of conversation in corridors about resources and trade and wealth. And I think the last point is that generally Napoleon and the French government, they both thought that, well, if we just kick the door in, the whole structure will just collapse. They thought Egypt was an easy target. So I think that's all the background to this rather weird and wonderful adventure.
Yeah, it does sort of make economic sense, doesn't it? I mean, especially that a good chunk of the West Indies, especially following the War of Independence, was still very much under British control. And I think the French had Guadeloupe and Martinique.
That's
so if
right.
they just wanted their own colony, it would just be that they could, if they took Egypt, they could have so much more of a landmass.
It does. It makes complete sense. And also, in the 1790s, the French West Indies islands, not only were they being attacked by the British, but those that remained with the French they had huge slave revolts following the Revolution. So there was a lot of anarchy and turmoil. And the French not really having a brilliant navy at that point meant that long transatlantic crossing was very, very vulnerable.
Yeah. I was the rising in Haiti, wasn't it? Was it?
That's
Haiti?
right. Yeah, there was a huge series of very bloody risings in Haiti, and of course, it's a part of the world that was very dominated by things like yellow fever, and so I think French planners were starting to think these are perhaps the best things to hold on to.
Yeah. I know from the limited stuff I've done on the sort of this period, there's the British units that were sent out to the British colonies were considered sort of units that you sent off to die. So that's where you put any criminals. It's like, we'll put them in the units that are going out to Grenada.
That's right. They're the expendables and the deplorables and the undesirables. And it was really incredible mortality rates in West Indies and West Africa. I think that generally the view was that Egypt had a much healthier climate, but that's before they encountered bubonic plague.
Which is always a bit of a buzzkill, to put it mildly. So they've travelled across the Mediterranean. How was the journey, and what were they met when they got to Egypt?
So yeah, the journey is quite a long one. So they set off in the early summer 1798 in a huge fleet. I think there's something like 300 transports.
Wow.
And a good number of men of war and frigates to guard them. It's the biggest expedition that France has put on for some time. It may even be the biggest they ever put on. I can't remember. But it's a very large force. Nelson is in the Mediterranean looking for them, which adds that undercurrent of tension, even as they set off. But generally in those times, any kind of travel by sea is viewed with great alarm by anyone who's not a sailor, and even by many sailors. I was reading an account by a French officer during the Battle of the Nile, and his ship's destroyed, and he ends up clinging to some mast in the sea, and he writes, really surprised me that he didn't know how to swim. And that's a naval officer. So yeah. I think even if they don't know how to swim, then pretty much guaranteed that the soldiers don't know either. So there's a lot of worry, a lot of fear, but things get off to a good start. They managed to take Malta very easily, which is held by the Knights of Malta. They've got a huge fortress there, a lot of guns, but the French are able to talk their way in and more or less bribe the surrender. And from there, it's a quick hop and a skip across to close to Alexandria. But there things are not quite so easy and not quite so friendly. So the French were kind of expecting that the locals, well, they're not exactly welcome them, but not be too hostile. But the local Mameluke warlords, Mamelukes are kind of slave soldiers who worked their way up to being governors of Egypt and managed to win autonomy for Egypt, even though it was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. So these Mamelukes, they fought back. They settled their differences with their overlords, the Turks, who also were prepared to fight back. So when the French arrived, Alexandria didn't open its gates and say, "Oh, we've been waiting for you." There was actually a siege, and the French had to storm Alexandria and to take the harbour so that they could bring their ships into harbour and unload all the supplies that they brought with them. So it wasn't a great start. And of course, the French had arrived, it set off a bit late, and they'd arrived right at the hottest time of the year. Although everyone expected it to be hot, and everyone had complained in Malta already that it was very hot, then Egypt came as a bit of a shock.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. And the uniforms were woolen jackets, weren't they?
Exactly. So they were. They're not the best costumes to be wearing, but by reading the accounts, and I've done quite a few of them in the book. It's all based around the accounts of the soldiers. The worst were the cavalry. So obviously they didn't bring many horses with them. So when they landed, the cavalry had to carry their own saddles. So you can imagine wearing those. Few of them had sort of brass helmets and woolen clothes and riding boots, and then they tried to carry these saddles. It was they were tough. They were tough men.
Yeah, you'd have to be, I suppose. But the other problem with Egypt is there is the massive logistical problem that anyone that's campaigned in Europe won't have to worry about, and that's the desert. So how much of a strain did this put on the army?
It was an enormous strain. So, as you say, Europe, it's a little bit different. The French were sort of used to living off the land, especially somewhere like Italy. There was land of plenty. But in Egypt, food and water were a huge problem. So the French landed quite a lot of ship's biscuit. So their immediate concerns were sort of taken care of. Everyone got a ration. But the lack of water was very quickly a major problem. It's not just for the men, but obviously in those days, cavalry and artillery needed horses. Artillery needed to be pulled by horse. And there wasn't enough water for the men. There certainly wasn't enough water for the horses. And I think one of the problems was that for some reason, the French had managed to remember to bring a grand piano with them, but they hadn't bought sufficient containers or canteens to carry water. So the troops were often left waterless for numbers of days. And in that kind of heat, willpower alone will not do. You need to be drinking. So in the accounts by the soldiers, that's one of the immediate and very, very quick problems to manifest itself, is this lack of water. Yeah. And then there were other sort of things that we don't perhaps consider, but lack of firewood. So when you're marching across the desert and you want to cook your camel meat or soup, and there's no brushwood or firewood around for 10,000 men, it's a huge problem. So there's a lot of adjustments needed to be made early on, and in the accounts you get an awful lot of moaning about lack of decent bread, no wine, no water. Right from the start, there's the real issues, and of course moaning was totally valid, but there was a real risk of dying of thirst and starvation, especially as Napoleon's big plan was, rather than march down the Nile, he was going to sweep across the desert quickly so his enemies didn't have time to concentrate, which sounds good. But sweeping across the desert when you've never been in a desert is not an easy thing to do.
No. I mean, we've done quite a few crusading episodes recently, and one of the things that when the European knights tried to do the same thing, they came a cropper, but the Saracens and the other sort of the Mameluke empires used to travel from water hole to water hole, so they could keep their armies fresh. And you had this amazing account of the French finding a well and them quickly drinking it dry, and not everyone got water, and that was just sort of terrifying. That must have been absolutely terrifying. That wasn't the men crushed to death and things trying to get to water.
That's right. I mean, I think if you 10,000 men arriving in a village at any one time it's a lot of people to distribute stuff to, but 10,000 desperate, thirsty, angry men, it doesn't get issued efficiently or easily. So there were quite a few episodes like that. And like I say, there's a real lack of containers, so they drink the well dry and then they have to be off again to the next well. It gets a bit easier when they get to the Nile, because they can start drinking Nile water, whatever that tastes like. But that's a bit better.
Yeah, I imagine if they've not really had much to drink for 2 days, it probably tastes
quite nice. Yeah.
But in retrospect, although I did love the continual complaints about some of the letters back. Like, I can't wait to get home. I keep picturing about being at home and drinking a nice red. It really tickled me.
Yeah.
So, but the French do get to Cairo. That's not the end of the campaign, and they get kind of met by disaster, don't they?
Yeah, things very quickly get worse. So you have this very dramatic, very glorious battle of the pyramids, which are not quite next to the pyramids, but you can more or less see them. And that opens the gates of Cairo, and the French are able to march into the capital, which is very important, obviously, in terms of conquering the country. But very soon afterwards, word comes that the French fleet up in the north, by the Nile Delta, at a place called Aboukir, has been intercepted at last by Nelson, who traps them between two fires and destroys them in a huge battle. And when word of that gets down to the French army, then obviously that's a huge and devastating blow to morale, because it means there's no real way, no easy way back. All the transport ships are pretty much trapped in Alexandria harbour, but with the warships gone, the British very much rule the waves. So that's not a great beginning to the campaign. And Nelson's victory, in a way, gives support to those countries that have been wavering about restarting the war with France, and it will eventually lead to the birth of a new coalition, a new alliance against France. And the Turks, I think, probably had Nelson's victory not taken place, might have perhaps come to terms and negotiated some kind of settlement with Napoleon. But Nelson's victory means that they become overtly hostile now, and very quickly. So what they do is, and this might sound familiar to listeners, that they declare jihad, which is holy war, on the French, and that's in September. And then in October, in Cairo, there's a huge revolt where the people, I mean, it's only a few months since the French have arrived, but the the opposition start smuggling in insurgents, and there's a lot of popular hostility to the new arrivals. And so that breaks out in a huge and very brutal uprising, the Cairo Rebellion, Cairo Revolt, which is very brutally put down. So there's great slaughter. Napoleon brings artillery into the streets. I mean, he's always doing that.
Yeah.
He does it again. He imposes huge fines on the city authorities. And even as weird things like the French stable their horses in the central mosque as a kind of ritual humiliation. They behead the ringleaders. So it's all the classic signs of an occupation that's already starting to go a bit wrong, excessive violence, and there will be consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you start doing things like stabling your horses in the mosques, that then feeds fire to the insurgents.
Exactly.
I mainly do the First World War and the Second World War and German occupations. Like, well, if you're going to kill one of our men, we're going to shoot 10 of your civilians, and then that just upsets people even more, and then you get more rebels, and it's the same sort of thing.
Exactly, and I think the sense of isolation. I mean, the French are already feeling that sense of isolation. It's a lot of people perhaps don't appreciate just some of the distances involved, and the fact that the French are confined really to a few key towns, and the rest of the country is hostile and dangerous, and that kind of kind of specific mindset develops from that. So the French get quite brutal, but the revolt in Cairo is a very nasty episode. It's not a great start to the occupation.
And that's was it I've sort of lost track, but there was where General Dupree was murdered with his staff.
Was right.
that after? Yeah. Which must have been a big blow as well to lose a general to insurgents. Yeah,
so he was the governor of Cairo, so that's not a great start. And there was a lot of the civilians that had come with Napoleon. So Napoleon not only brought an army, but he brought a band of scholars and intellectuals to study Egypt and Egyptian potential and Egyptian archaeology as well. Quite a few of those found themselves in Cairo and were massacred, or their scientific instruments were smashed and broken. So yeah, it was a very bad start.
Yeah, it was probably something that they didn't really bank on going in, because you didn't get that kind of behaviour in like European campaigns until sort of the Peninsula War. I think it gets a bit uglier.
That's right. I mean, there's no real sense in the accounts that I read and included of what to expect from Egypt. So, of course, there's always hope that you'll be met well, or there'll be a welcome, or at least people might be a bit indifferent. But there was no real sense that people would be hostile, which I find quite surprising given the differences between the two sides. But they'd never been anywhere quite like it, so they didn't really know what to expect, and it turned hostile quite quickly.
Yeah. So, what did the two sides of the conflict make of each other? Because this is quite as we've sort of gone over, it's quite a two very separate cultures.
Yeah, very different. I think the best way I can sum it up is mutual incomprehension. So I haven't looked at too many accounts by those from the Egyptian point of view. There were some chroniclers and historians who lived through the occupation and wrote accounts of it, which have been translated. Some of them have been translated French, some into English. So they're out there, but I haven't included too many of those in books. I'm trying to look at it from the point of view of the French soldiers and scholars. But what you get from just looking at those is that they were generally hostile to the invasion. It was a foreign occupation by non-believers who were on a crusade, and that sort of thing does not go down terribly well. A couple of examples of indifference to the French. But there are very, very few friends or supportive of what the French were trying to do. In fact, I think there's the only really positive remark I came across from an Egyptian was someone who really admired wheelbarrows. So the French were using wheelbarrows to transport dirt. And this Egyptian looked at them and thought, that's actually quite a good idea. And
That's fantastic.
So that's the only nice thing. That's the only nice thing I could find from the Egyptian point of view. And it has to be said that the French attitude to the Egyptians was also pretty universally negative.
Mm.
So, I mean, these are sons of the French Revolution. For a start, they're waging war. That in a sense is a bit of an ideological war. So they're very, very hostile to Islam. They blame that religion for the lethargy of the locals, what they see as lethargy, what they see as the ignorance, the lack of interest in things like science or development, and generally criticize them roundly for lack of curiosity. For example, it's quite an amazing episode where the French have brought some hot air balloons with them. So they've got a little company of balloonists, which the French armies were using in Europe as kind of observation balloons.
Yeah.
But they brought a couple with them to France, and some of them were sunk in a shipwreck in Alexandria. But some of the equipment made its way down to Cairo, and they had a unmanned flight, and the French were really pleased with themselves. But they looked around at the faces of the crowd, and the people just weren't bothered about it. And they take that really badly, and they blame religion for it. And the other thing, well, I have to say we're talking about a French army here, so perhaps there's a little bit of bias creeping in, but local treatment of women goes down really badly. So we get a lot of descriptions of women in burqas and how enslaved they are and how badly treated by their menfolk they are. And again, this is largely blamed on religion. And conversely, the Egyptians, when they look at the few French women that came over, take very badly to seeing women that are not veiled. So mutual incomprehension. Never the twain shall meet in a real sense. This is one of the first big meetings between East and West, albeit very heavily coloured by the fact that it's war and invasion, and you have to make allowances for that. This is a hostile environment, and people aren't writing nice things about threats and potential dangers. And again, with it being French soldiers, the sort of prohibition on alcohol also went down very, very badly with the French soldiers. But things improved a little bit when French established Africa's first brewery, which was opened by Monsieur Royer in late 1798.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
I think generally what we get from the accounts is that there's a general sense that if only they were more like us, they would be happier people. I mean, that sort of comes through from all the accounts.
Yeah, and if there's no local booze, we'll just make our own.
Soldiers being soldiers.
I know I'm going off in completely the wrong direction, but it just makes me think of Tsingtao beer. When the Germans set up their colony in China, it's like, well, the beer here is atrocious, so we're going to make Bavarian style ale here. Yeah, again, soldiers and sailors being soldiers and sailors.
Yeah.
But so we got Egypt. Egypt is finally sort of roughly held by the army, and Napoleon's now setting his sights on Syria. How did that campaign go? And was it, as we've sort of expressed, we've talked about his logistics must be massively strained by now, especially that he's not going to get any more reinforcements from France. He's got no warships. Is it a bridge too far to push into Syria?
It is really, considering the number of troops that he has available, but it's also something in a way that he has to do. So it seems like a really strange and almost perverse course of action. I mean, Napoleon's not really someone to sit around and do nothing. He's hyperactive. But this idea of invading the Holy Land seems sometimes to be almost like a sort of quixotic adventure, but it's not. He defeated the Mamelukes and established some control over the main centers of Egypt. But some of the Mamelukes had fled across to Gaza and Syria, Palestine and Syria. And some of the local warlords were giving them assistance. And by now the Ottoman Empire is also getting into gear and sending money, weapons, and increasingly men into Palestine. The area around Damascus, a large army was forming up. And in true Napoleonic style, because this is the kind of thing he did, Napoleon decided he would strike first before this army got together and came over into Egypt and perhaps sparked another uprising. So I think his vision was relatively sound, but of course he didn't really have enough men to keep Egypt passive and to make a lasting occupation of the Holy Land. And the move, he didn't obviously share his vision with the soldiers, because the soldiers all thought they were going to India or going to go home via Istanbul. So I think a campaign in Palestine did come as a bit of a shock to them. But on the plus side, Palestine in the spring is a much easier place to live off. So there are some really quite touching accounts of when the French come through Gaza. They see olive trees and orchards, and it reminds them of home, things like that. But then they soon come against Acre, Saint-Jean d'Acre, which is as you mentioned, this land was crusading land, and it's one of the big crusading castles, and it resists with British and Turkish help, and Napoleon is defeated there and has to come all the way back to Egypt, this time with far fewer soldiers with him. So it wasn't a success, but there is some logic to his madness.
So it wasn't sort of a case of hubris of, well, let's just keep going and see where we can go. It was a logical step.
Yeah, it was logical. I think if it were hubris, I think he would have gone to Jerusalem, which he didn't do. If he was, being the egotist that many people say that he is, that would have been a temptation for him. So I think it was quite. Yeah, it was logical.
Absolutely, riding into Jerusalem on a white horse.
He would have loved
the name in the history book. That would have been ego fuel. And I've just got the image of the painting of him going across the Alps on the white horse. But the Ottomans also strike at the French in Egypt, don't they? How does that go?
They do. So, as I mentioned when I just touched on the campaign in the Holy Land, the Ottomans were getting into gear, and starting to supply men to the warlords of Middle East. But they also had their own huge armies, and the British were able to intervene and assist. And one of those armies gathered in the island of Rhodes in the summer of 1799, and the British helped escort it across to Abukir, where we have a second battle of Abukir, which is the one a street in Paris is named after. It's not named after the terrible disaster.
That's the one we don't talk about.
That's the one they don't talk about. But this one is really quite an astonishing victory. Napoleon comes up from Cairo, and they more or less the Ottomans haven't gone inland very far. They've dug in along the coast, and the French completely roll over the trenches and chase them into the sea. And there's a huge massacre. And it's what is called in many history books a glorious victory, but it's a pretty brutal episode. But it gives Napoleon a victory, and perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that's a good thing to finish on if you're preparing for an exit.
Yeah, which he then does. He does I was going to say, trying to make it sound like Brexit and all. I thought, well, Egypt's an exit, so exit. Oh, damn it! But yeah, he that's why I'm not a comedian. But he does leave the army, doesn't he?
He does. But he abandons the army, and that doesn't go down very well. So you get a lot of jokes that work really well in French on Bonaparte. So bon à partir, bon à départ. So they make a lot of sarcastic jokes about how he just upped and left, and went back to France and landed in the south of France. Completely ignored quarantine, so there's no lockdown for Napoleon. Went up to Paris, and with his friends in government, they organised a coup, and Napoleon took over the government of France. But that didn't go down terribly well with those he left behind him. So there's quite a lot of bad feeling there, and they feel very abandoned, as they would. There's a British blockade. Napoleon had managed to evade the blockade. Some say, and this is a conspiracy theory from the time, some say that he was in cahoots with the English, and the English were all too happy to return him to get peace. But he'd avoided the British, but the French army in Egypt would have no such luck. The only way they could get back was either to march across the North African coast, which is just not viable, and even then you've got to get across the sea at some point, or to surrender. And you're not going to surrender to the Turks, and the British presence is quite small, so you're going to have to wait a little bit. And so they end up really like a besieged army in a very big prison, but a big fortress rather, but still besieged.
Yeah. So what does happen to them in the end?
Well, you get a few morale really goes sinks to rock bottom. There's a new commander though who helps revive things, General Kleber, and he does what he can to turn things around. He does actually try to negotiate an evacuation with the British, but sorry to say for British listeners out there that the British don't play fair.
Surprisingly.
And say, no, we never agreed to that. So Kleber's really left to his own devices. The Turks, meanwhile, have brought a big army through Gaza and into Egypt. And Kleber manages to defeat them. But then there's a second revolt in Cairo. And he manages to cling on, and things seem okay. But then, unfortunately, he's assassinated by what the French call a fanatic in the summer of 1799. So he's stabbed by a student. And I could do a weird fact alert, but the assassin is captured and he's impaled. French don't normally impale people, but a bit of local custom. And his skeleton's actually smuggled back to France when the troops leave. And it was actually on display in the equivalent of the French Natural History Museum until 1937.
Wow, really?
When it went into storage. So it's still in Paris.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So unusual discoveries when I was researching the book. But after Kleber, what happens next is you get and I've got quite a soft spot for the next guy to take charge. He's called General Minnow, or Minnow, and he went native. He married a local woman, converted to Islam, and he thinks he can make a colony by being reasonable. We can all get along. Everything's going to be fine. But unfortunately, he falls out, not with the Egyptians, but he falls out with the French generals. And that's really bad timing because finally, it took them a couple of years, but the British have arrived and landed 2 invasion forces, one close to Alexandria and another, including sepoys from India, has landed on the Red Sea coast. And so, it's only a matter of time, but the French, eventually, they surrender and the troops go home. But a lot of the goodies, including a lot of Egyptian artifacts, first amongst them the Rosetta Stone, mysteriously get confiscated and end up in the British Museum. There's a surprise.
I was going to say, as things do.
They do. So that's an end to the glorious adventure. I would say that, just by way of conclusion, that it was an enormously costly expedition, really quite bloody. And the outcome really wasn't unintended consequences. So the Turks sort of reimposed their rule over Egypt, but this time with a lot of British support. So the British find themselves as favoured allies in Egypt. But I think Napoleon's adventure sort of planted a seed a little bit certainly in French minds, that the Middle East and Africa could be a place for potential future empire. And of course, just 30 years afterwards, they occupy Algeria and start to add the other Mediterranean coastlines like Lebanon and places to their empire. So it's an odd episode, but for those taking part, I think you get a real sense that it was adventure, tragedy, but they look back on it with a real sense of pride that they'd sort of endured this and survived.
Absolutely. I mean, we were saying about the conditions in the desert and the lack of water, the fact that the army was still there the following year, even well after Napoleon had left, and that there was still use the term lightly, sort of fighting force, is an amazing event. And it, as you said, the whole expedition is a learning curve for future endeavours.
Yeah, and I think you kind of have to take your hats off to them. They didn't fall apart. They were still a cohesive body of men, and right to the end, even though morale was bad. And part of that is because the consequences of just simply giving up were terrible. But also, I mean, these were very experienced and veteran soldiers, and they had a real sense of standing together or falling. So reading their letters and diaries and to a lesser extent their memoirs, because memoirs tend to get embroidered, you can really see how tough they were.
Yeah, absolutely. In such a foreign climate, foreign culture.
Absolutely everything about Egypt was hostile. The weather was hostile. People were hostile. The animals were hostile. You name it. Even some of the food was hostile.
And then probably the Nile water as well.
I'm sure that was hostile.
Braver men than me, I wouldn't drink it, but
you stick to the beer.
Yes. Beer won't kill you, apparently. Just in brackets, I'm not a doctor, don't take that as medical advice. So but no, this would be really interesting. Thank you for coming on and talking about this campaign. I know I've learned quite a lot from it. But could you remind everyone the title of your book and when it's due out and where they can get it from?
Thank you very much. It's called Napoleon's Invasion of Egypt, an Eyewitness History. It's published by Amberley, and I think it's literally just been published in the last day or two. And it's available in all good bookshops and many of the bad ones.
Absolutely. And talking of bad ones, we'll put it on our bookshop, which is a good one online.
It's a good one.
Which means the podcast gets a tiny slice of any revenue, but you as an author will get more money than if it went through one of the bad online ones that may or may not sound like a rainforest somewhere.
We're mentioning no names.
No, because I will get sued and I don't have any money. but thanks again for coming on and talking.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. Thanks again.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.